Hey guys, we'll continue this. I think I'll be able to get the rest of my lecturing in this segment here, so we'll have two parts for the week. So we left off with Johnson deciding not to run again in 1968, and he leaves the Democratic Party really in like total shambles here. So just kind of think going into the convention, that's where you should have the clear-cut person who's going to run for president. You should have that person decided. That's not the case for the Democratic Party. And if we were to backtrack and look at this chaos just a little bit, you got to understand that everyone assumes the sitting president, is going to run again when he's up for reelection, right? So currently, President Trump, he's running for reelection. That's just kind of the standard that the incumbent runs again. Well, LBJ was getting challenged from within his own party. So, looking at his situation in Vietnam, his low approval ratings, the fact that Bobby Kennedy, RFK, was looking to get the nomination, LBJ just decides not to run again. So, Bobby Kennedy, RFK, looks like he's going to get the nomination. He's kind of flying through. He's got the support of a whole lot of people. But what happens to Bobby Kennedy? Oh, he's assassinated. So he's assassinated, and it just leaves the Democratic Party with no clear leadership. There was Eugene McCarthy, who early on he made a lot of headway being an anti-war candidate. But you got to understand that the Democratic Party, well, not LBJ, not RFK, it's not going to be McCarthy. There's even a question of Pegasus the Immortal. More on that in a second. That's an actual pig that was nominated for the president. A pig. Yes, I'll give you pictures. Well, the ultimate nominee for the Democrats in 1968 was the vice president, who was a pro war candidate, and most of the Democratic Party at this point was against the war. So they end up with a pro war candidate. What does that do to the Democratic Party? It splits three different ways. So as a result, the convention in 1968 was just outright chaos, where there were riots outside the convention. All of this stuff was televised. I'm going to give you a 2-minute clip on this where you can see some of the protests and the troops and the major clash where people are protesting, shouting, "The whole world is watching! The whole world is watching!" The mayor of Chicago, Richard Daley, he didn't like these protesters. He, in fact, called them bums, and he sends out the Chicago police, the National Guard, and they're not so nice to the protesters who were there. You'll definitely see that in the video clip that I show. But you got to understand this 68 convention, outright chaos. These guys are kind of behind some of the chaos. These are the Yippies. The Yippies are like call it a radical segment of the Democratic Party. They're the Youth International Party. These are the guys that nominate Pegasus the Immortal for president. And they actually like say, "Oh yeah, we were trying to find the best pig and this is going to be our candidate." And these Yippies are behind, all sorts of pranks. Uh, One time the Yippies, they go on Wall Street and they get all this fake money and they're like throwing out the fake money to show the capitalist greed, and people are like swarming to try to get all the fake money. The Yippies once held a protest at the Pentagon where they were all going to like meditate and then levitate the Pentagon. Well, maybe some of that stems from their flag here. You can see the Yippie flag. Yeah, they wanted to legalize drugs. So many were drug users. Again, kind of think of the whole 1960s, hippie type atmosphere. Well, clearly by calling themselves Yippies, they're embracing a lot of those, radical ideas. These are your two Yippie leaders, Abbie Hoffman and Jerry Rubin. I think Abbie Hoffman has a famed scene in Forrest Gump. If you've seen that, you know it. Jerry Rubin, this guy's fascinating because he was investigated by Congress and he tried to make a mockery out of the investigation. Where once he shows up like he's dressed for the American Revolution, and then he tried to hand out copies of the Declaration of Independence, and a bunch of his supporters would do like a Nazi salute to just try to show The fact that he's being questioned by the government for his whole free speech. He once tried to show up as like a Vietnam guerrilla soldier. So yeah, these are your yippies. These are some radicals who are out there. You should at least be aware of Abbie Hoffman and Jerry Rubin, and they're the again radical, extreme radical wing of the Democratic Party. Well, with that radicalism out there, and the Democratic Party split so many ways, who's going to ultimately win this thing? This you should remember, Richard Nixon. And Richard Nixon's campaign, it actually appeals to a whole lot of people because he's campaigning saying, hey, we want law and order. Law and order really resonates with people as they see the chaos outside the Chicago Convention. And the people that are voting for Richard Nixon, they're the so called silent majority. As for Nixon's plan in Vietnam, his slogan is peace with honor. Peace with honor. Oh, we'll see about the honorable part momentarily, because he's not going to be so truthful about, in fact, expanding the war in Vietnam. So again, 68, they say that this is the most turbulent year in American history. Um, as you're aware of some of our political turbulence and polarization today, there are some people comparing kind of our atmosphere today with those of the late 1960s. So for all of my lifetime, things have been, relatively tame. But the polarization in 1968, they say, was as chaotic as it's ever been. So I don't know about today, but anyway, you should understand that 1968 definitely a chaotic time. Also, don't forget about this guy. Remember, the civil rights movement is in full swing, and when Johnson went pro civil rights, George Wallace breaks away the Deep South with his campaign for segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever. Wallace also spoke out about the Vietnam War, and he, quote, wanted to bomb Vietnam back into the Stone Age. So, yeah, he carries the Deep South. Nixon gets the victory, but just look at the mess of this electoral map here. And you can see that the Democratic candidate, he's not going to pull much support because the Democratic Party was split so many different directions. As for Nixon in Vietnam, he's got a plan called Vietnamization. This is basically to increase our troop presence, but let the South Vietnamese do a lot of their own fighting. That's kind of what it says on paper. We want to increase, get like a surge, and then gradually withdraw and turn the fighting over to them. Well, we don't really gradually withdraw. In fact, Nixon secretly expands the war into Cambodia. You can see the map here, North Vietnam, South Vietnam. The big question at this point was how the Viet Cong in the north kept getting all their supplies to people in the south. And they used something called the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which went through Laos and went through Cambodia, and they would deliver all of their supplies to people in South Vietnam. Well, Nixon's plan, he escalates the war to secretly bomb Cambodia, and he's trying to bomb the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and he's going to create quite a bit of chaos in Cambodia. If you're familiar with your Cambodian history, maybe you know something about the Khmer Rouge that will develop in the aftermath here. I think world history teaches it, but it's kind of late in the process of world history, so I'm not totally sure. Anyway, here's Nixon's plan. He's going to end up expanding the war, and he does this in secret. He doesn't really tell people about secretly bombing Cambodia. And as a result, the protests, when this stuff is eventually revealed, will increase more and more about Nixon's expansion of the war and his backtracking on the whole peace with honor statement that he had campaigned on. As for some of the protests, they're now turning deadly. The most infamous example of a deadly protest happens in Ohio. This is at Kent State. I'll give you an actual Neil Young song that's all about the Kent State massacre, where college students are shot down by the National Guard. So Kent State turns bloody. Uh, there was Jackson State, which was like an African American college that also turned bloody. And again, you got to understand that in this atmosphere, in this turbulent time, You got hundreds of race and political riots in 1968 alone. So these are two that turned bloody, students being killed. I'll show you that video. I think you've heard the song. You'll have to do just a brief analysis of Neil Young's Ohio in a minute. This one's interesting, the Hard Hat Riot. These are Nixon supporters against the protesters. So it's now protesting on all fronts. And these hard hat riots, these are like construction, blue collar workers who are sick of all of like the young kids protesting. So it's like a counter protest that also is violent. And then there's a prison riot as well, where many people see this as like a symbolic riot of the oppressed. All of it's happening under Nixon's watch. Big one to focus on, the big one to remember is going to be Kent State and that Neil Young song that I'll have you guys look up in a second. This was the Hard Hat Riot, by the way. They thought the mayor was a communist, impeach the red mayor. So construction workers against kind of the protesting crowd. As for Nixon, well, it was eventually revealed that he lied and expanded the war into Cambodia. So Congress wants to finally take their power back, and they do so with the War Powers Act. But if you guys understand how the legislation process works, Congress makes a law, then the president can either sign it into law or veto it, right? Well, Nixon vetoes this thing. Congress then overrides the veto to take back the power to, call the shots in Vietnam, essentially. And they're doing this because of the whole Cambodian issue. When it was revealed that he's lying a bit about the war, Congress decides to take the power back. This cartoon makes fun of the whole thing. Imagine Congress trying to curb my right to conduct unconstitutional wars. Why, that's unconstitutional. See, kind of funny. His, I don't know, toy aides here who can be wound up and do whatever he tells them to do. So anyway, that's one of the famed cartoons about the War Powers Act. This overrules that Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which I'm hoping you remember from the previous segment. Here's a bit about Nixon. I'll cover more about his paranoia, especially when I get to Watergate and his like enemies. To just brief you on it, Nixon literally kept a list of all of his enemies, and he would want to destroy his enemies. Well, one enemy was the press. He hated the press. He always thought the media was out to get him, so he would continually condemn the press, especially after this thing is released, the Pentagon Papers. I don't know if you've seen this movie or if you have all sorts of free time right now. Maybe you want to watch The Post, but it's about the release of the Pentagon Papers, which like document and prove that the government was lying about Vietnam. The Pentagon Papers go all the way back to the Johnson administration, showing that they were lying, and then Nixon was as well. Well, Nixon wants to prevent the release of these Pentagon Papers. New York, the Post, they're going to publish it anyway, and then Nixon tries to like get Daniel Ellsberg. You'll see this more in Watergate, but Nixon's got like this group of so-called plumbers. They're going to stop the leaks. He would complain about leaking, so the plumbers stop the leaks, and they do all these dirty tricks where they illegally broke into Daniel Ellsberg's doctor's office and stole all his medical files to try to discredit him. They were trying to arrest Daniel Ellsberg on conspiracy charges and all sorts of other stuff too, but that all fell through. But the point is, the Pentagon Papers are incredibly damning for Nixon and Washington in general. You guys remember that credibility gap? It goes up and up and up with the release of these Pentagon Papers. Watch that movie if you have time. Winner Best Film of the Year. Tom Hanks, Meryl Streep. Good movie, good times. Well, Nixon, you'll see he eventually has to resign, but the Vietnam War was technically still going on. And Gerald Ford, our lone Michigander as president, inherits kind of the tail end of the situation in Vietnam. As for Nixon's accomplishments, they eventually were able to sign like a ceasefire. and we kind of stopped fighting by 1973, but we still had a presence in Vietnam going into the Ford administration. So just kind of understand the big stuff with Nixon in Vietnam, peace with honor, not so much with the honorable part, Vietnamization, wanting them to do a lot of their fighting. That doesn't work out, and we end up illegally expanding the war into another country. So Ford inherits the tail end of all of this stuff when he takes over. Quick side note on his Michigan roots. There he is playing for the bad school in Michigan. Some of you are that school's fan, but he played football for that school in Michigan, not mine. And his name is plastered all over the place in Michigan. When we travel there, you can go like in the footsteps of Gerald Ford. See, he once went to that candy shop visited by President Ford. If I fly in, I fly into the Gerald R. Ford Airport. Ford, by the way, was known as being a little bit of a klutz, and he was lampooned all the time on Saturday Night Live. Gerald R. Ford, he once fell off the stairs of the airplane, Air Force One, when it was parked. So he would trip and fall a lot. And Saturday Night Live, notably Chevy Chase, would make fun of his klutziness. Anyway, to conclude on Gerald Ford and the war, he's there when it's all done. By 1975, the North Vietnamese, they drive southward, and any American that was left has to escape Vietnam because the North Vietnamese are taking over. So there's this famed exodus, like from the American embassy, where people are desperately trying to get on helicopters to get out. The North takes over, the North wins, the North turns it communist. Did we win this war? No, we did not win the war. Now, again, technically, we signed a ceasefire in 73, so I suppose technically we didn't win or we didn't lose. Technically, we didn't lose the thing. Maybe it was a tie. But why did we get there to begin with? We got there to contain communism, and that was a big loss because the North drives south, they make it communist. It still is today. Well, look at the cost. 118 billion, 56,000 dead, 300,000 wounded, and it's going to cripple our foreign policy for the next, like, I don't know, 6, 7, 8 years, where we're kind of weak for our loss in Vietnam, where you'll see our next administration, they got to put a Band-Aid on a bunch of situations, and we're not considered the mighty superpower we were going back to World War II. So just think about it. We're in Vietnam for 20 years, 1950s to 1975, and we can't defeat little, North Vietnam in a guerrilla war. So, yeah, definitely problematic on our foreign policy. As for the overall death toll, it's up there in terms of all of our American war deaths. I believe this chart is probably 3, 4 years old by now, so that one's ticked up a little bit. But you can see 58,000, that's up there in the grand scale of things. Now, as for all these veterans, like all the veterans who fought over when they came back, that's a whole nother story because these guys struggled. The Vietnam veteran experience, a lot of these guys are still, like today, suffering from PTSD. I don't know if you got a grandpa that maybe fought in Vietnam, but odds are they don't want to talk about their experience in the war. Many turned homeless, drug addiction, and they're just not really supported by the people when they came back. There are stories of these soldiers being spit on, people shouting "baby killers." I don't know if I have the video clip, but a Vietnam like soldier was returning, and people in the plane refused to sit next to the guy because they called him a baby killer. Think about the media. Think about all the stuff people saw. These veterans are going to struggle in a much different way than their parents did when they came back from World War II. I think you've heard this song, which recaps quite a bit about the Vietnam veteran experience. Have you ever heard Born in the USA? What many of you might think is a patriotic anthem that you play on the 4th of July celebrating America, born in the USA, born in the USA. But if you listen to the lyrics, it's not this proud patriotic anthem. The guy's a Vietnam vet who's unemployed. His brother died in the war, and at the end, he ends up going to jail. if you listen to the lyrics, other than just that chorus, he's actually critical about the United States. He's saying he was born in the USA, but he can't get a job and he doesn't have any support. So listen to that song, maybe your next 4th of July celebration. Uh, that kind of wraps up Vietnam for us. I've got a bunch of video clips that I'm going to upload that I think can further highlight this. But again, let me know if you have any questions. You got to pace yourself through the week on all of this. Closing questions due Friday at 11:59 a.m. Everything else will be due Sunday night. Please let me know if you do have any questions or concerns. Have a good week.